The Aussie NFL Fantasy Show would like to acknowledge the traditional land owners and the leaders past, present and emerging of Ngunnawal, Ngambri and Darawal countries where we are working from today. This always was, and always will be, Aboriginal land.
Hello and welcome to the No Huddle Dynasty Fantasy Football Podcast. I'm your host Mark and I'm looking forward to sharing this episode with you. But first, I'd like to give a shout out to the guys over at the Aussie NFL Fantasy Show. This is the #1 Australian-made fantasy football podcast. The guys are the absolute best in the industry, delivering top-shelf content every single week. Make sure to stop by and check out Manjot, giving out his fresh pastries to the previous week's top performers. While you're there, make an appointment with Taylor for Dr. Goodcall to predict some wholesome fantasy starters for the current week. Then check in to see Matty C putting the guys through their paces in Fantasy Cliffhanger, before finally listening to the guys battle it out in Starts of the Week. You can find them on all social media platforms. YouTube, their handle is youtube.com/@Aussie NFL Fantasy. Twitter, it's at Aussie_fantasy. Instagram, Aussie NFL Fantasy. TikTok, at Aussie NFL Fantasy. As well as Spotify and Apple Podcasts. Now, back to the show. After a bit of an unplanned hiatus, I'm back again to deliver you some more Dynasty Fantasy Football content. On today's show, we're going to be going through our second edition of the Rolling Team of the Year. There have been some pretty wholesale changes made to the team, so in the essence of trying to keep these episodes as short as possible, we're just going to cover off the team content today. I will do a second episode later in the week that I'll mention a bit more about at the end of the episode. But for now, let's get started. So for those that tuned into our earlier episode when we went through the original Rolling Team of the Year, or the first version of it, you'll note that we base this off preseason ADP, and we apply their current rank versus the expert consensus ranking. So this is a culmination of a multitude of different analysts and their, opinion of where they're going to rank versus what they've already put out in terms of fantasy points and what their rest of season schedule looks like. So what we then do is apply an average points per game, and we do that thanks to Fantasy Pros. We apply their average points. For quarterbacks, it doesn't really matter, but for running back, wide receiver, and tight end, it's half-point PPR. And we just try to match, or get an idea of what that team would look like as a fantasy score weekly. And I know every league's a little bit different, but it's kind of cool to look at what sort of fantasy output you could get on some of these guys that, for the most part, generally aren't seen as a one at their position. So we're not looking at quarterback 1, running back 1, wide receiver and tight end 1. Generally, these guys are at most a second tier option at their position, flex or even bench players to start the season. So our original team of the year for the first update was quarterback was Trevor Lawrence, running back 1 was Ramondre Stevenson, running back 2 was James Robinson, wide receiver 1 was Garrett Wilson, wide receiver 2 was Drake London, tight end is Gerald Everett, and flex we went with Rashad Bateman. Now, in all those cases, those players went from, there was only one player in the top 20 at their position. That was Trevor, who was quarterback 19. So for this week's, after a fair break and some more data to compile, there have been a couple of changes. I think they're justified changes. We have gone with a change at quarterback. So the new quarterback for our team is Tua Tagovailoa. So his ADP was 138 overall, which in a 12-team league is 12th round, 6th pick. That would have made him quarterback 16. His current rank is quarterback 7 and an average points per game of 19.49. Now, his upcoming slew of games is Chargers this week, Buffalo next week, Green Bay, New England, and New York Jets to finish off. Now, when we break down some of these matchups, and we do this to try and forecast where these matchups might lead and whether or not this player has favourable matchups coming up and whether we can expect them to still stay, I guess, in this area, or whether or not there's going to be a fall away or whether they could actually rise. So the Chargers are 17th against for passing yards, 26th for passing touchdowns. What we know about the Chargers this season is they can't stop the run, and they're very average in the red zone. So that matchup could, could drag him back to the mean. I know he didn't have a particularly good showing compared to what he has done this season last week. 49ers defense is legit, though. We know that. So I'm going to call that a plus matchup because the yards and touchdowns will be there. But I could see a scenario where they run a lot. Where Miami decided to run a lot. Buffalo is 15th for passing yards, 9th for passing touchdowns. Very good versus the run and red zone. So they're going to force him to pass. Now that game, I think it was week 3 this year. Obviously he looked fine until there was the knock that he took, concussion or not getting into that. But that game sort of ended more. The defense had to win that for them. So this one will be a really interesting one. It will probably be in the snow. And we know from, I guess, what we've seen last season is weather is a big thing for Tua. So because he grew up in Hawaii, went to college in Alabama, there's not a lot of snow there. I think there's ever been snow there. I could be wrong. Not from the States. So that could play a factor. Green Bay are 9th against passing yards and 18th against passing touchdowns. They're not good versus the runner in the red zone. So I guess I would probably call this a plus matchup only because Green Bay just haven't been their regular selves this season. I think they can get it done. I think this offense is offering enough that we would consider that a plus. New England are 6th against passing yards, 16th against passing touchdowns. Good versus the run and the red zone. So they're a good all-round defense. I'm going to call that a negative matchup only because I feel like that game at Foxborough is going to be a tough one for him. I think Belichick will finally get his first win potentially over Tua. As a Miami homer, if any of you know me outside, that hurts. But I just feel like that game will be scripted. I think Miami will take it easy because we're talking about the second last game of the season. Hopefully by then they've locked up a playoff berth and they could start to, I guess, rest some stars for what will hopefully be a decent playoff run in this very sad Miami Dolphins fans' history. I haven't experienced one of those yet. So, and then to finish off, New York Jets. So number 4 against for passing yards, number 3 for passing touchdowns. Average versus the run and red zone. So I feel like this will be a big RPO game. Probably, I'm hoping that they again will probably lean into Jeff Wilson and Raheem Mostert a bit more. So I'm going to call that a negative matchup. So out of the next 5, getting back to the point of this, is 3 of the next 5 games I would consider plus matchups. So that should keep him in and around, I guess, that quarterback 10, unless someone really, I guess, blows up in this last stretch of games. We could probably expect him to stay here. Barring injury, and as I said, I guess something we're not expecting. So, good result there. So we've also had a change at running back. So, running back 1 in our first edition was Ramondre Stevenson. We've kept him in here. He's running back 2. I'll run through his stats and then I'll highlight which change we made. So, Ramondre in our first edition of this was running. He's running back 36, so 90th pick overall. That would have been 806 in a 12-team league. His rank in our first update of this was running back 26 and an average of 9.58 points per game, half point PPR. So in our update, same stats obviously. He's jumped to running back 11, so he's considered now. I guess we would call him a running back 1. and his average has jumped up to 14.10 points per game. So massive jump there. When you look at that team's passing attack, you can understand why he's so valuable. Who do they pass to outside of Jacoby Myers and whichever tight end decides to turn up? The upcoming slew of games is Arizona, Las Vegas, Cincinnati, Miami, and Buffalo. So it's actually a pretty tough schedule. When we look at their individual stats, so Arizona are 9th against rushing yards, 19th against rushing touchdowns. They are bottom of the league versus the pass and red zone. So there could actually be a bit of PPR value for Stevenson here. And I would actually call this, even though they're not giving up a lot of rushing yards, they're giving up a lot of touchdowns. And while Damian Harris is sort of a non-factor, he's getting that work. And we've seen that. Like, he's taking the lion's share of everything, and it's got sort of a mix of, I think, 2 or 3 different guys behind him that are just spelling him. Las Vegas are 18th for rushing yards, 24th for rushing touchdowns. They're bottom of the league versus pass and red zone, so similar story. They're going to be able to move the ball fairly well, although they can't stop the run. So this is an absolute plus matchup for Stevenson. Cincinnati are 13th for rushing yards, 16th for rushing touchdowns. They're above average versus the pass and red zone. So they're giving up a lot of yards. Very much bend don't break for Cincinnati this year, which is kind of weird. They've traditionally been a really iffy defense, but they're actually having a pretty good season. So I'm still going to call this a plus matchup because you're talking average for yards and touchdowns, so there's always the chance for that broken play, and he's absolutely good enough that if they can create a lane for him, he'll take it to the house. So we'll again call that a plus matchup. Miami are 8th for rushing yards, 19th for rushing touchdowns, terrible against the pass and in the red zone. So what this highlights is if New England can get the ball to the red zone, they score more often than they don't or teams score more often than they don't against Miami. So I'm going to call this a plus because of his usage. The only asterisk I have next to this is if Damian Harris is back, I feel like that will take a little bit away from Stevenson. But for now, we'll call it a plus based on the information we have. And Buffalo are 4th against rushing yards, 9th against rushing touchdowns, below average versus the pass, and they're pretty good in the red zone. So we're going to call this a negative only because that match, it's the last one of the season. If there's a few different storylines to this, if Miami really lift and win a heap of games, actually I feel like this could come down to that Miami-Buffalo game. If a miracle happens and Miami beat them, then Buffalo are going to have to really come out and win by a lot, and then pray Miami drop a game somewhere, which I've predicted. I think they lose that game against the Patriots. Anyway, so we're interested to see how that comes out. I'm going to call that a negative based on just how staunch they are. I know the loss of Von Miller is massive for Buffalo, but we'll just see how that washes out. As of right now, Stevenson is absolutely running back one. So the running back change that we've picked up is we went in the first edition of this. We had James Robinson, who was 122 overall, 1102, running back 42, and he was, at that time, current rank was running back 28 and 14.30 fantasy points per game. In this one, we've decided to go with Josh Jacobs, who is having an absolute monster season. Anyone that owns him in fantasy, you would not be disappointed with any investment. I know he's been a bit iffy sort of the first couple of years, but he's absolutely paying off any investment you had in him. He's having such a great season. So his preseason ADP was 50. It was 502 in a 12-team league, and it would have been running back 22. So if you were doing a startup, you would have got him sort of as that maybe running back 2 possible flex. He's currently sitting at running back 12, and average points per game is 20.2. So again, like to have an average of 20, we're talking about almost blue chip running backs. So that's your Derrick Henry area. It's a massive result for him. And I actually feel like when I was looking this up, he's actually the number one scoring running back this season. So that's awesome stuff for him. And it's nice to see something good come out of that Raiders team, which I know they've had such a rocky couple of years. It'd be really hard for their fans. So obviously all that promise with Devontae Adams coming in. So yeah, nice to see something good come out of that. Their upcoming games: Los Angeles Rams, New England Patriots, Pittsburgh 49ers, and the Chiefs. So we'll just jump through these pretty quickly. So Rams are number 7 for rushing yards, number 9 for rushing touchdowns, bottom of the league versus the pass. But they're pretty good in the red zone. New England are 10th against rushing yards, 1st against rushing touchdowns. They're very good versus the pass and red zone. Steelers are number 6 for rushing yards, number 3 for rushing touchdowns, bottom of the league versus the pass, and average in the red zone. 49ers are 1st against rushing yards, 11th against rushing touchdowns. They're very good across the board versus the pass and red zone. So as we know, they're probably the top defense in the league. And Kansas City are 5th for rushing yards, 5th for rushing touchdowns, and bottom of the league versus pass and red zone. So out of those, I would say he's got a pretty tough schedule coming up. I would consider probably the Rams is going to be a good matchup for him. He will probably have a pretty good yardage day against the Patriots, but they're not giving up a lot of... not giving up many scores at all, obviously first against touchdowns. So that one we're going to call a plus, but purely just based on yards. Pittsburgh matchup, we're going to say it is a positive, but we're going to hope he has a pretty good red zone day. Also, they get to the red zone and he's just got a good PPR day, so a lot of passing. 49ers is a tough one, and Kansas City's probably a similar situation to Pittsburgh, that we'd want him to really feast on the pass. So pretty cool change there. So jumping into the wide receivers. And what we've found with our wide receivers is we've actually made wholesale changes compared to the first edition of this. So our wide receiver 1 and 2 was Garrett Wilson and Drake London. For our update, we have gone with Amon-Ra St. Brown and Chris Olave as wide receiver 1 and 2 respectively. So we'll go through Amon-Ra first. So his preseason ADP was 63rd pick overall, which would have been 503 or wide receiver 25. His current rank is wide receiver 10, which means if you were doing a startup, you would have drafted him as potentially a wide receiver 2 or even a flex, and you're getting wide receiver 1 production from him, which is fantastic return on investment. His average points per game is 15 points on the dot. So we'll have a look at his upcoming games. Now, we've got Minnesota, New York Jets, Carolina, Chicago, and Green Bay. So Minnesota are 32nd against the pass, so absolute bottom of the league. 28th for pass completion, 11th against passing touchdowns, and average versus the run and in the red zone. So we know that it's going to be Goff, and he's shown that he can do it. He's going to have a pretty big day if they want to, I guess, beat the division rival. It can be done. He's had great... We've seen him sort of fire this season already. So I feel like this is an absolute plus matchup for Amon-Ra. New York Jets, we've already touched on when we went through the tour notes. So we're going to call it a negative matchup just based on the fact that their secondary is playing really, really well. So we won't dive into that one too much. We know that's a negative. Carolina are 11th versus passing yards, 20th versus passing completions, 9th versus passing touchdowns, below average for the run and in the red zone. So Again, we'll probably call this a plus matchup based on they can move the ball. Their defense isn't locking receivers down, I guess, like the best defenses in the league. So this is probably going to be another plus matchup for Amon-Ra. Chicago are 19th for passing yards, 4th against pass completions, 11th versus passing touchdowns. They're bottom of the league versus the run and red zone. So this game is probably going to be a big Swift game. They are giving up a lot of passing yards, but I think what we've seen is it's blown coverage. It's big plays. So they're taking away a lot of the underneath stuff. But we know if they manage to get the ball downfield, so through a broken coverage, or if they can run it down using Swift, which could very well be the game plan. I could actually see that like this being a big game for him, being how easy they are to run on. You could get a bit of joy from Amon-Ra down, a good touchdown game from him. So we're going to call that a plus matchup. And then Green Bay is the final game for them for the season. We're going to call this a plus matchup based on the Tua notes. We know that you can move the ball. They do give up a lot of touchdowns. So, yeah, we'll go with a plus there. So, out of the next 5 games, I've got 4 of them being plus matchups, 1 negative being the Jets. So, if you're an Amon-Ra owner and you're still in the playoff hunt, or if you're looking for some value for next season, like he's a good candidate to potentially get you some good value back. He's certainly shown it. So, our final wide receiver 2, is Chris Olave. So his preseason ADP was 113 overall, which would have been 10.05 in a 12-team league, which makes him wide receiver 44 at the start of the season. His current rank is wide receiver 13, so he's just outside what we would consider in a 12-team league wide receiver 1. But from wide receiver 44 to there, fantastic value. His average points per game, half-point PPR, is 11.40. So any investment in him outside of... Because, again, you would have probably had him as maybe a flex, probably a bench stash. To be delivering that kind of production is outstanding considering the mess they've had at quarterback this year. And you would imagine in this offseason, they will figure something out there more long-term. So the arrow is absolutely pointing up for him. Here's stretch of games coming up. So they've actually got a bye this week. Then they've got Atlanta, Cleveland, Philadelphia, and Carolina to finish the season. So just diving into a couple of these quickly. Atlanta, 29th versus the pass, 30th for pass completions, 22nd for passing touchdowns. They're bad across the board in terms of run and red zone. So I guess the only risk here in that matchup is if Kamara gets going, this game could blow out pretty quickly and he may not deliver the points you would expect him to in a tighter contest. So on paper, this is a great matchup, just whether or not the game script supports that. Cleveland, 12th against passing yards, 8th against pass completions, 16th for passing touchdowns, below average versus the run and in the red zone. We're going to call this a plus matchup purely based on yards and touchdown potential. They'll be able to move the ball. This will be another big Kamara game, just based on you can run on them. Miami had a field day and they don't have a great running game, or a great established running game. Kamara is a beast, so that's going to be a big matchup for him. I feel like that will open up for Olave to I guess if he does have a down matchup against Atlanta, that'll be a good bounce back game. Philly are number 1 against passing yards, number 8 for passing completions, and number 6 for passing touchdowns. Above average versus the run and red zone. Actually, a really good defense, and I think we've touched on this on a previous episode. They are over delivering versus expectation. I think for a lot of people. I mean, even your most staunch Jalen Hurts fan or believer would never have expected him to deliver this. So that team's doing really, really well. I'm going to call this a negative matchup just based on the fact they're locking down a lot of stuff on the back end. So if they can establish the run, then you might see him sort of break off a couple of long passes, maybe jag a touchdown, but they're not giving up much in the way of yards. So they're taking away the deep play, which is a shame. But so we'll call that a negative. And then Carolina, we've already gone through with Amon-Ra just before. So we're going to call that a plus matchup. So out of the next 5, obviously there's a bye, so that's a wash. So out of the 4 upcoming games, we've got 3 plus matchups, 1 negative. So again, we could see him maintain his position here. Hopefully we see him improve his average points per game. And finally, for our tight end, now last time we had Gerald Everett, who he was 219th pick overall, which is 1903, tight end 26. His rank at the time was tight end 18, and average points per game was 10.28. Tight end is an absolute mess. This time we've gone with Greg Dulcich. So he actually didn't even appear on the preseason ADP, so there was no number for me to pick for him. So he would have absolutely gone undrafted. So this guy you were getting for free. His current rank is tight end 10. Average points per game is 7.20, which is actually 3 points less than our previous update. But as I said, like outside of maybe 1 or 2 tight ends, it's an absolute nightmare trying to fill that position and with any sort of certainty. When we look at his upcoming games, we've got New England, Denver, Tampa Bay, Atlanta, and San Francisco. So New England, we have them 6th versus passing yards, number 2 for pass completions, number 16 for passing touchdowns. They're above average versus the run and red zone. We're going to call this one a negative because I think when we look at tight end, we rely on a lot of sort of those PPR points and potentially jagging a touchdown. I know they're giving up 16. They're 16th in the league for passing touchdowns, which sort of has them bottom half of the league. I just feel like they will lock up a lot of the run, and I just don't see the game script being there for Dulcich in that one. So we'll go negative there. Denver, number 3 for passing yards, number 17 for pass completions, and number 1 for touchdowns, passing touchdowns. They're very good against the run and in the red zone. I'm actually going to flip that. I'm going to go, this is a plus matchup because of the passing completions. They're giving up a lot of short, so it's a lot of bend, don't break, which could actually be pretty good for him. So we're going to have that one as a positive matchup for him. Tampa Bay are next, so 5th against passing yards, 13th for passing completions, 18th against passing touchdowns. They're very good against the run and red zone. So similar stories above. I'm going to have this as a positive matchup. They're going to need to pass, I guess, early and often. You're probably going to see a lot of sort of over the middle stuff, short, quick outs, that sort of thing. So we'll go positive matchup there. Atlanta, we've been through with Olave. That's going to be a positive matchup for Dulcich in that one. San Francisco are 8th for passing yards, 14th for pass completions, 3rd for passing touchdowns, above average versus the run and red zone. What we've seen is if Nick Bosa is right to go, he's the main disruptor. Like I haven't seen an offensive lineman really lock him out. So I think, again, a quick passing game is going to have to be what they do. San Francisco do have really good linebackers in Warner and Greenlaw. So I feel like, again, that sort of short to 10 yards over the middle, quick outs, they're going to be sort of how they're going to have to move the ball. I don't think there's going to be much in the way of deep passing. So... and Kyler, as athletic as he is, I mean, you can only run from Nick Bosa for so long. So that'll be a really interesting matchup. I'm going to have it as a negative only because we've just seen San Francisco destroy good offenses. So So we've had a bit of a change at flex as well for this one. So our original flex was Rashad Bateman, who was 76th overall, which was 704, wide receiver 31. And his rank at the time was wide receiver 19, delivering 10.20 fantasy points per game. So we've gone with another wide receiver because I think, as I said in the original one, they are over-delivering this season as a whole position versus expected ADP. We're seeing the greatest growth there. Running backs have been fairly volatile. They've had good weeks and they've had bad weeks. Josh Jacobs, who's been a standout, but as a position group, it's been a tough year to own, I guess, any high end pieces. So Devonta Smith is our flex for this update. His preseason ADP was 96th overall, which would have been 8.12, so end of the 8th round in a 12-team league, which was wide receiver 37. His current rank is wide receiver 20, and he's delivering 10.30 fantasy points per game, half PPR. So, again, what we're saying here is if you did a startup in this last offseason, you could get Devonta Smith as your flex if you had two flex positions, possibly even a bench stash. He's delivering borderline wide receiver towards the end of wide receiver 2 numbers, which if you can get that in your flex position, it's a fantastic result. Obviously depending on your league scoring. But so let's jump into his upcoming games. So it's got New York Giants, Chicago, Dallas, the Saints, and Giants again to see out the season. So this should be a pretty quick one because we've touched on a couple there. We will touch on Giants first. So Giants are 16th against passing yards, 5th against passing completions, 6th for passing touchdowns. They're average against the run and red zone. So we're going to call that a plus matchup. We know Devonta Smith isn't he isn't looked at, I guess, or he's not used as a high target option. He's very much just down the field, 20 plus yards, and is pretty good in the red zone. So we're going to go plus matchup here just because the yards are there. And Giants are average in the red zone. So we know there's a fair chance he'll have a good touchdown day. Chicago, we went through with St. Brown. We're going to call that a plus matchup. Again, based on yards, I feel like that's a similar situation to the Giants. Giving up plenty of yards, not so many completions, so big plays. Dallas, number 2 against passing yards, number 8 against passing completions, number 6 against passing touchdowns. They're below average versus the run, but they're pretty good in the red zone. So we're going to go negative matchup here. There's not a lot for wide receivers in this matchup. It's going to be Sanders and Jalen Hurts doing a lot of the work on the ground. New Orleans are 18th against passing yards, 20th against passing completions, and 11th against passing touchdowns. They're really bad against the run, but they're good in the red zone. So I'm going to go plus matchup based on yards and touchdowns. Completions are there, but as we mentioned, he's not a big completion PPR type wide receiver. He's very much big play and touchdown dependent. But that's a plus matchup. And Giants we've just touched on earlier. So out of the upcoming 5 games, we've got 4 plus matchups, 1 negative. So there's a better than, I would say, a pretty good chance that we're going to see Devonta Smith hold on to his spot. So just recapping that, our very first edition of the Team of the Year was Trevor Lawrence, Ramondre Stevenson, James Robinson, Garrett Wilson, Drake London, Gerald Everett, and Rashad Bateman. Out of the total average points per game that they were delivering at the time, that worked out to be 86.16 fantasy points on average. In this update, we've moved to Tua as quarterback, Josh Jacobs, Ramondre Stevenson, Amon-Ra St. Brown, Chris Olave, Greg Dulcich, and Devonta Smith. Just recapping their points per game. So it's 19.49 for Tua, 20.2 for Jacobs, 14.1 for Stevenson, 15 for Aman Ra, 11.4 for Chris Olave, 7.2 for Dolcic, and 10.3 for Devonta Smith. That adds up to 97.69 average fantasy points per game. So we've lifted our average by 11.53 points per game. So what that's telling us is obviously bigger sample size. You're seeing more players sort of lift their average. Could go two ways, I guess. So if in a slower offensive season, so if defenses really start to take over, the average would obviously drop. We're seeing offenses really take off. And some of these players, pretty much at every position, we've gone up in average. The only drop was at tight end, but we know that that's a mess. So, again, you apply your own scoring to this, but in my home league, 97.69 points would generally keep you in a lot of games. You'd probably win more than you'd lose. So to end up with a team like this, if you were to draft this, or if this was sort of pieces that you accumulated and this was your starting lineup, you'd be pretty happy. I think, well, I certainly would be based on what I allow for each position. That would win me more games than not. So that's going to wrap us up for today. On the next episode, I'm going to be doing an episode, an extra one in a couple of days. We're going to be doing that episode purely based on the running back, rookie running backs expected to come out. So just a couple of names to watch for. Because as we're getting closer to the off season, this is sort of content that we're going to be covering after the fantasy season finishes. So that's when the Dynasty content really starts to lift. So we'll do running backs as a standalone episode. And then we'll look to add wide receiver and tight end in the coming weeks. So just to give you a list of names just to start keeping an eye on, I guess, towards the college finals, college playoffs, and then going into the off-season program. So thanks again for checking me out. You can find me on Twitter and Instagram at NoHuddleDynasty on both. Any questions, please feel free to shoot them through. I'm more than happy to address any content that you're curious on. If there's something you're not sure about, or something that you've heard on another podcast but it wasn't explained and you just want a bit of a deeper dive on it, please hit me up. More than happy to help out there. Thanks for checking, and I'll see you on the next episode. The next episode.